Good evening. Welcome to those who are joining us tonight for the first time and to those who are joining again, both in person and through the live stream. The presentation is being recorded and will be shared with those who pre-registered the link for the first two YouTube recordings that were shared in last week's summary email. I am honored to introduce Dr. Mervyn Langley as the speaker of today's presentation, which is the last of his 3-session series. Tonight's presentation focuses on helping kids with ADHD, related anxiety, and oppositional behaviors. Dr. Langley has an extensive knowledge base and background. He earned his PhD and worked as a research coordinator for the South African National Council on Alcoholism. He was associated with a major research study to develop motivational and coping strategies through the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, and he has published multiple journal articles and book chapters in the US, Spain, and South Africa. Dr. Langley provides therapy to children and adolescents through Aurora Behavioral Health on a variety of mental health disorders such as ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, oppositional behavior, and depression, helping them learn, understand, and utilize treatment strategies for their particular mental health needs. During the first presentation, Dr. Langley shared key information about what is or what is not ADHD. The second session focused exclusively on practical strategies that parents and educators can implement. Tonight's presentation will focus on how disorders such as anxiety and oppositional behaviors can occur simultaneously with ADHD, strategies in helping these students, and when additional treatment modes should be explored. Tonight's presentation will also reference some of the same strategies and tools that were shared the past 2 weeks, including some of the handouts, which are in the Google folder that was emailed yesterday. Questions are welcome throughout the presentation. However, they will be held into the end, so they are not to impact the flow of the presentation. If you are participating through the live stream, please type your questions in the chat. If there are issues with the sound of the presentation through the live stream, please comment in the chat. If you have a question and are here in person, please ask your question in the microphone. Otherwise, the people listening through the live stream cannot hear it. And also in the email that was sent yesterday, in addition to the handouts and PowerPoint, there is a certificate of attendance and a Google evaluation form. We would appreciate if you complete the short evaluation and provide your feedback about the presentation. For those attending the presentation in person, if you prefer, there is also a paper copy in your packet of handouts. So without further ado, Dr. Mervyn Langley.
Great. Thank you very much for coming to all of these presentations. I'm very happy that you're able to do that. You will notice that I put my email on there, and the reason I'm doing that, is that there are 3 ongoing parent groups that are one of them is in its 2nd generation, but the other 2 will begin in December and January, and they'll just be repeated. And these 2 groups go into this material in a lot more detail, and they meet weekly for about 12 to 15 sessions, so it's 12 to 15 hours. They are under the child's name, so if the child is the patient, but the parent attends the group. The child does not attend the group. So these are parent groups, and parent interventions like that are very effective. And so the feedback from my oppositional defiant group has been very positive. So if you want to contact me about any of those groups, feel free. The second one will be specifically about ADHD and how to actually do that scaffolding of executive functioning, and step by step. So instead of doing it in an hour and a half, will take a long time. We'll have some good discussion about that. And then the third one will be related to anxiety, not just ADHD related anxiety, but anxiety in general. So, all right, so let's get to work here. And so to recap, let's look at the first slide, the executive abilities. And so this is all about these abilities. So if we can go to the first slide. Yeah, that's okay. Not coming up? Sure. So as you will recall, there are different words that are used for these executive abilities. And if you would look at 10 different texts, you would get 10 different presentations of what these executive abilities are. I have chosen to use a model that focuses on the development of these abilities from beginning and progressive, the unfolding of these abilities. So really the first and most important executive ability is inhibition and self-order of. And it is a difficulty that the child has because of the brakes, the ability to put on the brakes. And so the word that kids with ADHD hear more than any other word is the word stop. And if you listen to kids who have ADHD in a classroom setting or at home, you hear parents, friends, people saying, stop doing that, don't do that, please stop that. And the reason is because the executive center of their brain is having difficulty putting on the brakes. Medications like Adderall, Concerta actually stimulate the brain that are responsible for inhibition and so improve the brain's brakes. But these abilities are going to be delayed by 40 to 50%, 30 to 40%, I should say, and sometimes even more. The question is, no one knows the answer to this, are they permanently delayed? Or in some cases, does the delay last forever? And I believe that it does. For many children, the delay would be permanent, and in that sense, the impairments become impairing over a lifetime. But it is still possible for the child to find workarounds, which is what the treatment is all about. I was thinking about something last night. Who of you have read the work of Oliver Sacks? So he wrote some wonderful books like The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and just beautiful books about music and neurology, essentially. And in one of his books, Oliver Sacks talks about a man who was a conductor of a university choir and was very passionate about music, and then developed viral encephalitis and developed the worst case of amnesia imaginable. He could remember nothing. He remembered his wife's love for him, but he didn't remember her. So if she had come to visit him, a minute after she left, he would be on the phone calling her and saying, "Why have you forgotten me? You never come to see me anymore. Can you just come in and spend 10 minutes with me?" And this would go on call after call after call after call after call. And, the man was miserable. And his wife, she wrote a book about this, by the way. It's a beautiful book, apparently. I haven't read his wife's book, but he one day he loved music, and he would hum along. And one day she took him to the chapel just to get him to a different area, and they could hear, and she began singing from a hymn book, and he began singing the other part. And she was surprised that he could do this, that his knowledge of music was so great, even though he had no memory. He couldn't remember anything. And so she had an idea. She thought, I wonder if I got his university choir to come here, whether he would be able to, how would that be for him? And so they brought the choir in, and he led them. And as if he had never forgotten anything. It was an incredible, you can imagine, he was in his element. He was overjoyed. He was leading this choir, and everybody was just aghast that he had this ability. So this is an example of how we address teaching of executive functions. Once the choir had left, his wife said, "Do you realize what you just did?" And he said, we didn't do anything." And she said, "Well, the choir was here and you directed them." And he said, "Oh, you're crazy. I didn't do that." And that was a few minutes before. They'd just left. He had no memory of it. So what had happened, though, is that his wife had tapped into something in his brain, learning by procedures, learning by doing, something that was so overlearned in his brain. And that's how we teach executive abilities. We don't teach information, we teach by doing over and over and over, lots of repetition. And so that's how we're going to work on improving these things, and also how they affect anxiety and oppositional defiant disorder. So the other ones are self-awareness, the mind's mirror, and you see that all the time. Kids with ADHD are not aware when they cross lines. They're not aware of social cues they miss. They're just not that self-aware. And of course, that is built on the fact that they don't have brakes, so they're not putting the brakes on. Visual imagery, the ability to picture what happened before and what comes next, hindsight and foresight, and also to sense the movement of time, to picture yourself relative to time, is impaired. The mind's eye. The mind's voice, self-talk, the ability to internalize speech. Kids with ADHD talk out loud for much longer than neurotypical kids do. And that's actually a good thing. We shouldn't stop that. We should encourage that. And then ultimately they internalize that speech. Self-regulating emotions, the mind's heart, the ability to stop and regulate emotions, to build in a pause, and then to reconsider one's emotional response. And also the other thing that is what is important in that stage as well, is that in that pause, if the person is able to have a little bit of a pause, they can split information into two parts, the factual information, the informational information, and the emotions that they have towards that information. Once they can split that off, they can have a more nuanced kind of response. And then finally, playing in the mind. Children learn problem solving by play. And I was watching a little boy with ADHD. I always sit on the carpet with little kids, and it's fun to watch them play, building Lego, and how they'll take apart something another child had built, and they'll kind of look at it and examine it, and they'll take it apart and build it in a different way. That's problem solving. They're taking apart a problem and rebuilding it in different ways, putting different pieces in, trying different outcomes. That's what problem solving is all about. So let's look at ADHD-related anxiety specifically. And let's go to the third slide. Maladaptive coping due to ADHD leads to anxiety. So it's the next one, that one. Okay, so coping is what a person does to push through a hard situation. It's a skill set that includes different skills. So if you are coping with stress, you may have different ways of relaxing, of unwinding, but it's a whole bunch of different things that you do to cope with stress. Kids with ADHD have poorer coping skills because of deficits in these executive functioning. They're not able to put the brakes on, they're misreading cues, they have problems with social problem solving, and so their coping abilities are impaired. If the more impaired their coping abilities, the more likely they will be to use escape and avoidance behaviors. They will try to get out of a situation that is stressful, or they will just avoid it altogether. And so you have many, many children with ADHD who miss a lot of school. I talked to a child the other day who told me that in the last year, she's missed something like 38 days of school. I don't think that's unusual at all. If pushed past that frustration tolerance, the child will actually have a kind of panic. Now, this is different from panic attacks that people have when they don't have ADHD. So, the definition of panic is fear of one's own body sensations, fear of one's own fear. That's what panic really is. But these are children who are just pushed to the point where they just are not, their coping has collapsed, and they're having this sort of specific ADHD-related panic. And when they're in that state, this part of the brain, their logical brain, it's not working properly. So even though they have some difficulties with putting on the brakes and with these executive functions, in a state of panic, in a state of fight or flight, it literally isn't working at all. So when you ask a child with ADHD who's had this kind of panic episode, if you ask him what happened, they'll say, I don't remember. And they often don't remember. It's not that there are times when a child will say that because they don't want to talk about it or they feel embarrassed. But a lot of times I believe they honestly do not remember that because the thinking, memory part of the brain just isn't working at that point. So you can imagine how that's going to affect problem solving as well. Let's go to the next slide. And so some attempts at coping actually make things worse. And it's very important that you understand some of these. Many people who have children with ADHD will say that the child tells lies. And that is certainly a problem. So why does that happen? Well, if you think about it, if the teacher says, Joe, did you hand in your homework? And the child realizes, I didn't do it. I forgot. And now I'm going to get yelled at again. I'm going to be told, stop. I'm going to be told something negative. If they tell a lie, they're going to get away with it at least briefly. the teacher will, if the child says, well, I put it on your desk, the teacher will give the child the benefit of the doubt. So for that moment, he doesn't have to face the wrath of her frustration. And so lying is very adaptive. It's a very good coping strategy in the short term, but it has long-term implications. The child gets into trouble the next day, or has to do the homework and loses the grade, or things like that. So lying is not a helpful behavior, but in the short term, it's a very good coping strategy. And then there are other examples of that as well, like tearing up homework to avoid doing it. Tearing it up, throwing it away. Well, I didn't have that homework. I didn't get it. Again, that's, I guess, a form of lying, but that's another problem. Then we have things like procrastinating. Now, procrastinating is a wonderful behavior. I'm a huge procrastinator. But procrastinating is very helpful, because if you don't do well because you procrastinated, you can say, there's only positive reinforcement. You can say, I didn't do well because I procrastinated. And if you did do well, you can say, didn't affect me. My procrastination didn't hurt me. So there's kind of like no downside to procrastinating. So kids do it. They keep doing it. And they wait for that little adrenaline push right at the end to get it done. If you have ADHD, you know all about that. And then there's self-handicapping, which is another attempt at coping, which ends up making things worse. So what happens with self-handicapping is the person will do something like not study for an exam on purpose, or not prepare for something, or just not do it. And then when he doesn't do well, when he gets a bad grade, he could say, I didn't do well because I didn't study. So he's not studying on purpose, in a sense. Now, it might be sort of semi-unconscious, but it works really well. You see this a lot with addiction, where people will self-handicap on purpose. The kid who smokes marijuana, who's 16 years old, who says, I do badly at school because I smoke weed. And that protects his self-esteem. He can say, well, I'm a smart kid. I'm really good at what I do. I'm just not doing well because I smoke too much marijuana. So if you suggest that he cuts down, well, then how's he going to explain when he doesn't do well? So the self-handicapping becomes a deliberate, semi-conscious kind of activity. And you see this a lot with addictions, where people will self-handicap on purpose in a way. And then missing school. If you miss enough school, you're not going to do well. It's a coping mechanism. It gets you out of the immediate stress, but you pay the price for it later. Automatic negative thoughts often then begin to emerge. So when a child uses a bad coping strategy over and over and over again, he or she, it becomes a habit. Lying eventually becomes a habit. When I do treatment with kids who have ADHD, I emphasize truth-telling. And I say to parents, if your child tells you the truth, don't punish. If anything, you should reward that, even if it's not a good thing. I did some shoplifting. That kind of honesty needs to be rewarded. Truth-telling is important. So again, don't focus on the negative behavior, the lying, focus on its positive opposite, which is truth-telling. And then you don't have to focus on stopping. These automatic negative thoughts become very intrusive and very painful for kids. And this is really important, they draw on resources in the same part of the brain. So the verbal expressive part of the brain, Broca's area in the prefrontal cortex, which helps you to put words together and organize your information in a word form, is also impacted by these negative self-statements. So this then becomes a problem with test anxiety, where kids are sitting in a test situation. They're needing to use that part of their brain to do the test, to interpret the question, but that part of the brain is being consumed by these negative thoughts like, I'm not good enough, I'm going to fail, I'm going to do badly. And that that's happening when you ask a child afterwards to look at the test and you say, did you know the answer to this question, but you gave the wrong answer? And the child will look at it and say, yeah, I did know the answer, and I did give the wrong answer. And that's because it's drawing on resources in the same part of the brain, and it's just overwhelming those resources. And the stereotypes about ADHD become incorporated in the child's self-esteem. So for example, the idea that I'm lazy, or, I'm an ADHD kid, I can't pay attention, I can't concentrate. These kinds of stereotypes become part of his identity and part of his negative self-talk. Let's go to the next slide. They reduce self-efficacy. So self-efficacy does not mean self-esteem. Self-efficacy is your belief that you can carry out a behavior that will lead to a certain outcome. If you have high self-efficacy, it's always in relation to something specific. And the higher your self-esteem, your self-efficacy, the more likely you are to succeed at that behavior. If your self-efficacy is low, you won't even try it. You will avoid that thing, even though you're quite capable of doing it. And so, self-efficacy is very, very important for us to understand. This negative self-talk diminishes a child's self-efficacy. How do you learn self-efficacy? You learn it by succeeding. So we need to work really hard with kids who have ADHD to help them to succeed, which means breaking the subject up, breaking the task up into smaller parts so that they can gradually get better and better and better and better. Kids with high self-esteem are much more likely to take on a challenging task and see it through. And kids with lower self-efficacy will avoid that task entirely. And then, of course, these thoughts increase the panic, fight or flight, and freeze reactions. When that happens, the prefrontal cortex will switch off, and the child will not be able to resolve problems as well as they might otherwise. It's interesting that people who are traumatized experience a similar thing. So trauma, when trauma occurs, the person is in a state of fight or flight. And so their prefrontal cortex is literally switched off. You don't have time to think in a crisis situation. An example is a couple who were driving back from Canada, and their car, they went through a patch of dense fog, and within minutes they had zero visibility, and they began to hear cars smashing into each other. Eventually they smashed into somebody, and they were sitting in the car waiting for the next car to hit them. At one point, they saw a semi-truck literally fly over them, launched right over them, landed on a car in front of them. The car was set on fire, and the person in the car in front of them was killed, was burned to death. There wasn't anything anybody could do. There was something like 37 fatalities on that highway that day. When asked to describe what happened, husband and wife couldn't say. They said, there was an accident. We don't remember the details. And it took a long, long time for them to be able to piece together the information in order to work through that trauma. Because at the time of the trauma, their prefrontal cortex was just not working. It had switched off. They were in a state of fight or flight. So that's what happens with kids with ADHD. They get into this state where they're not able to perceive an option because that part of their brain isn't working. So here are some things that happen in classrooms, and particularly in classrooms, but also in the family situation. We need to change the failure to praise ratio. So for kids who don't have ADHD, research has shown that something between 3 and 5 affirmations are required to counteract one negative experience in the classroom. So 3 to 5 to 1. With kids who have ADHD, even a higher number of affirmations are required to overcome one negative experience. Except that for the child with ADHD, there are way more negative experiences, and teachers are exhausted with constantly affirming and redirecting the child, and the child gets fewer affirmations than even neurotypical children. We need to focus on mastery goals, not performance goals. The difference is a performance goal is something that requires a comparison. When you get a B or a C, that's a performance goal. You compare yourself with other people in your class and you say, I'm not as good as the average student, or I'm doing terribly. Last week, I had a child who made a serious suicide statement. And when I talked with her, it turned out that this is exactly what was happening. She was comparing herself with other students and saying, I'll never get this. I'll never be at the same level as the other students. And she went into panic and had suicide thoughts. This is not uncommon. So what is going on there is that she is comparing herself with her peers. And if you're a young teenager, you're comparing yourself, especially, on social media and so on. It's a huge problem. So we need to try to get away from those performance goals. And the way to do that is to go to mastery goals, where you don't compare yourself with others, you compare yourself with yourself. The goal is to do better than I did last time. It means structuring that in some kind of a way where the child can see their performance relative to their previous performance and see improvement, which will also build their self-efficacy. I learned this very quickly when I was in college. And I ran with the university club, and the other runners in that club were outstanding. One of them was the world champion in ultramarathon running. And one time I tried keeping up with him in a half marathon, and I got to about the 4.5 kilometer mark, and I just gave up. But up until that point, I was pretty proud of myself. I could see him. And here I am, my heart's pounding. I'm running with everything I have. And he's running along, waving at people. Somebody would give him a little bit of vodka, and he would swig it down in the middle of the race, and then nobody looking, that sort of thing. And I thought, how does he do that? It was marvelous to see. His name was Bruce Fordyce, wonderful guy. And, I realized very quickly, I'm never going to be able to do anything like that. So what did I do? I tried to improve my personal time. And that's what we need to do. We go for mastery, not performance, not trying to compare ourselves with others. And that's what we need to find clever ways to do that with kids. Now let's look at the next thing, parental accommodation of the child's fear. This is a huge problem that occurs with anxiety. The most powerful way that we can help a child with anxiety is to stop accommodating their fear. Now you might say, come on, I don't do that. But I'm telling you, it's very, very common. You know that the child is anxious about going to school. And so, he says he's not feeling well. You know that that's not the issue, but you keep him home. You're accommodating his fear. And as long as you're doing that, his amygdala, the fight or flight center of the brain, is never going to learn that the thing he fears doesn't happen, or if it does happen, it's not as bad as he thought. So we need to stop accommodating our children's fears. Now, sometimes we just don't know that we are. An example with obsessive compulsive disorder is the child washes their hands frequently, so the parent makes sure that there's lots of hand sanitizer and lots of towels, fresh towels in the bathroom. They're accommodating that fear. And partly it's because we don't get proactive. We don't think about it ahead of time. We're just trying to help. But that is not a helpful behavior. There are two kinds of accommodations that parents make. The first is avoidance behaviors. And this would be, for example, writing a note to say that your child has social anxiety and shouldn't have to give a speech in front of the class. Instead, they should rather give that speech just to the teacher, or do it privately, or something like that. That's an avoidance behavior. We are helping the child to avoid confronting their fear. And if we do that, their fear will grow. It'll get worse. And their amygdala will learn that there really is a problem. On the other hand, if they're able to gradually, with lots and lots of support, give that speech in front of other kids, their amygdala eventually learns that what I feared would happen doesn't happen. You see, the frontal, sorry, I just have to find my slide now. Sorry, I jumped into a totally different place. So what the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the conscious problem-solving part of our brain, and the amygdala use two different kinds of learning. So the prefrontal cortex can learn mostly from information And so if we reassure a child, we're focusing on that prefrontal cortex. The amygdala doesn't learn from that kind of experience. It doesn't learn from information. It learns by experience. So if you are afraid of, heights and you repeatedly go to a high place, you feel immense fear, but you stay there, and then you do it again and again, either in your imagination or in person, and you do it over and over and over again. Eventually your amygdala realizes the thing that I fear doesn't happen. Or if it does happen, I can get through it. And that's called habituation, when your brain is able to do that. So kids with anxiety learn through habituation rather than information. In fact, we are going to talk in a little bit about teaching skills for coping with anxiety and stress. But in reality, when you're trying to teach the amygdala, you don't want to teach skills. You want to wait a little bit with the skill training so that they can feel the full impact of their anxiety and their brain can habituate to that. Just like, when you jump into a cold pool at the beginning of the season, if you jump into, in May or June, the water is really cold, but it doesn't stay cold forever. You habituate to it. Your temperature normalizes and you don't feel so cold anymore. If you get out of the water immediately, then it's just as bad when you go back in again. So the best thing to do is just stay in the water, get used to it, and then you're good. That's what this is all about. We want to keep people in that situation where they habituate. So avoidance behaviors would be like writing the note that your child shouldn't have to give a speech in front of her class because of her social anxiety. A safety behavior is what you do to make the feared outcome not as bad. The biggest form of safety behavior that parents do is reassuring their child. Now, I'm not saying you should never reassure your child, but there's a way to do reassurance that is more helpful. Take obsessive compulsive disorder. So I'll give you an example. I had a little girl that I saw who was 7 years old, who it took 3 or 4 sessions for her to tell me what she was, what the basis of this intrusive thought was. And you can imagine how painful this is for a little child. But the intrusive thought was that the image of, she'd seen a sumo wrestler. And then for some reason, the thought came into her mind that he must have a really gigantic penis. And now she's 7 years old and she's ashamed and she feels horrible for having that thought. And now it becomes intrusive. And she stops watching television. She stops looking on her computer screen. She stops talking about words that even sound the same. She is now in a state of complete avoidance of that term. So what do? If we use logic and we say, you really don't have to be afraid of that, you haven't done anything wrong. She knows that. She knows all that. We're preaching to the choir. She knows all of that. It's not a logic part of her brain. It's her amygdala that has become afraid of that term. And it's not because she's been molested or something like that. None of that's true. Kid with great parenting, she has obsessive compulsive disorder. These are intrusive thoughts, and they are followed by a ritual. And guess what the ritual is? The ritual is she asks for forgiveness, or she asks mom and dad, or she goes and tells mom and dad, and they reassure her that she's a great kid and that these thoughts will go away. And so that reassurance makes her feel a little bit better in the short term, but then the intrusive thought comes back again. So the treatment is for her to confront those thoughts, to look at pictures of sumo wrestlers, to look at, to write the word penis over and over again and say it over and over again. Each time it causes her a great deal of angst and anxiety until she begins to habituate to that, and her amygdala realizes that she is safe and that it's not shameful. And the horrible thing about obsessive compulsive disorder, by the way, is the part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, that is heavily involved in OCD is also where your conscience resides and your sense of guilt. And so when people have OCD, they often feel guilty and they feel ashamed. and they feel that they've done something terribly wrong. And there's even a word for it. It's called scrupulosity, which is the belief that you have offended God. And so a child will believe they've offended God about something that we realize is just an intrusive thought. It's not even their thought. I tell little kids, it's like my son lives near a lake and deer walk through his backyard. And I say, are they his deer? No. Does he have to chase them away? No. Does he have to prevent them from coming through his yard? No. They will just pass by themselves. That's what intrusive thoughts are like. They're just passing through. So we don't need to do anything about them. But as you can imagine, for a little 7-year-old, that's an incredibly anxiety-provoking thing, and she feels incredibly helpless. She did really well, by the way, in about 3 sessions of exposure and response prevention. So the response prevention, by the way, is teaching her parents not to reassure her, but rather to do something else, which I'll explain in a second here. So why does avoiding situations why does it feed their anxiety? When we avoid a feared situation, we feel relieved. That's called negative reinforcement. It ends an aversive state. If we give the child a letter that says, when you feel anxious, you can leave the classroom, we are ending an aversive state, and it feeds their anxiety. It doesn't make it better, makes it worse, because the child learns that there really is something to fear here. And they also don't learn that they can stay in that situation and habituate to that fear and overcome it. So it doesn't teach their amygdala that they're actually safe. And it convinces our brain that there really is something to be feared, and prevents us from learning that the thing we fear doesn't happen, or if it does happen, it's not as bad as we thought. So we want to kind of plan to stop accommodating the child's fears. So first of all, you have to ask yourself, when I have an ADHD child, am I accommodating any of their fears? One of the biggest ways, as I said, is school avoidance. We need to make it clear that you need to go to school. And we need to find a way to slowly work to that goal. And there are some tools that we will talk about soon that help you to do that. You can talk to your child about why that's important and why you're going to be strict about that. You can also make the decision that you're no longer going to use this kind of reassurance that actually ends up not helping. Don't rationalize things with the child because the child knows that he has to go to school. So you're preaching to the choir. It's his amygdala that's afraid, not his prefrontal cortex. If you're successful in ignoring some of the behaviors that you will see, the child will try really hard to get your attention back. And you have to continue with that before those behaviors are finally extinguished. You're not being an unkind parent by doing this. So let's just look here. Seem to be missing. I'm going to jump forward a little bit, and then I'll come back. So a note about reassurance seeking. I just want to a few slides further down, and then we're going to come back. So a note about this reassurance seeking. Reassuring your child is a safety behavior. You're trying to save them from the fear they feel. And actually what you want to do is help them to work through that fear. That's very hard to do as a parent. And remember, in the case of obsessive compulsive disorder, the child knows, at some level they know that these thoughts are intrusive and that they're irrational. It doesn't stop them from having them. So you telling the child that there's nothing to worry about isn't necessarily going to help. There was a little boy that I saw who had obsessive compulsive disorder, whose intrusive thought was, and again, you shouldn't even think about why did he have that thought. It doesn't matter. It's an intrusive thought. It's the deer walking through the yard. It's not his thought. And in fact, we all have, by the way, we all have intrusive thoughts. The difference between us and kids with ADHD is that we are able to dismiss them, and sometimes without even thinking about it. Have you ever driven down the road and you see some lights coming towards you, and you have a brief little instinct of pulling in front of the car? Who of you thought that? I have. Would I do it? Absolutely not. I gave a lecture one time to a bunch of police officers about obsessive compulsive disorder, of all things. And as I was signing in, the police officer standing next to me, his gun was like right there, or on this side. And I fleetingly had the thought that I could just grab it. So then when I was giving the lecture, I mentioned that. I said, that's an intrusive thought. I have no intention of doing it. And the cops were all kind of like looking at each other and wondering if they should be worried about me. But that's what happens, though. These are intrusive thoughts. They don't mean anything. So this particular little boy, his intrusive thought was, I hope my mother's friend gets cancer. And because remember, same part of the brain that controls conscience and the sense of remorse and guilt, he was just so plagued by this and so ashamed. And so what is the behavior? He asks mom for forgiveness. He prays repetitively for forgiveness for this terrible thing that he's doing. It's heartbreaking because actually it's just an intrusive thought. It means nothing. There's no intent. It's what is called an ego dystonic thought. There is no intent. It's not ego systonic. If it was ego systonic, he would really want her to die. But it's not that. It's just a fleeting thought that comes through. And probably the worst thing you can think about is the thought you're going to have. Another person was an adult I saw who had a fear of the word kill. So she couldn't watch television anymore. She couldn't read books in case there was the word kill. If somebody said, I want to just kill that mosquito over there, it would produce a tremendous amount of fear for her. And then shame. See, it's always shame that comes with it. And with kids with ADHD, they have enough shame anyway. So what we have to do is help them to face those fears. And instead of using reassurance, you can do things like use guided discovery. You can ask questions like, we talk about some tools in a bit, but one of the tools is to give the anxiety a funny name. So you can say, is that dread pest I'm hearing? And the child knows that what you mean is, I'm not going to give you reassurance because that's your anxiety speaking. That's your amygdala speaking. You can say to the child, what do you think you could say to yourself about this thought? Is there another way to think about it? And when I've done enough education with kids, they'll say, my amygdala is afraid. My amygdala is afraid, not my brain, not my frontal brain, not my thinking brain. And so they begin to understand. It's amazing how much little kids can understand neuropsychology if you teach it to them in simple ways. It's actually kind of little 7-year-old, when she was talking about what was happening in her brain, I marveled that she grasped it. It's beautiful to see. And then it demystifies the fear for that child. Use planned ignoring with the child's consent to say, to help you to stop using safety behaviors, or me to stop using safety behaviors, I'm going to ignore your request for reassurance. Do you want to talk about that before we start doing that? So that the child knows that if I ignore that, if I simply don't respond to it, it's because I love you, not because I don't love you. And then when the child is able to move away from requesting that reassurance, you can praise them. So a good question is just to ask, rather than answering the child's questions, am I a bad person? Say, what do you think? And they know the answer. The front part of their brain knows the answer. So here are the tools, going back to the tools. The first tool that you want to teach kids is to use the fear thermometer. The reason this is important is for them to realize when their fear starts going down. You see, with exposure, the fear starts going down very quickly, but you want them to be able to see that. I'll give you another example of obsessive compulsive disorder. And this was a kid who did have ADHD, by the way. This was a familial thing. His father had it. I treated his father many years before because I'm really old. And his grandfather had it. His uncle had it. And then now he has it. So it's actually, and his aunt had it too. So very strong familial transmission of the obsessive compulsive disorder. So the thing with him was he had this fear of germs around his mouth. So what would happen is he would drink he would drink like a soda, and then he would burp, and then he would feel that there were germs around his mouth, and so he would blow them away like this. And then, of course, he's a eighth grader, so his friend starts saying, "Hey, Joe, why do you do that?" And oh, there, you did it again. And they start making fun of him. And this is embarrassing to him, and he can't stop it. Now, if you ask him, "Do you have germs around his mouth?" he would say, "Well, yeah, they're my germs." He knows that. You see, his brain knows that this is not a rational kind of response. It's his amygdala. His amygdala has chosen this particular behavior as something he needs to focus on. Who knows why? But for some reason, his amygdala sees that as a threat. So what we did was an exposure therapy procedure. And one of the steps was for him to drink a diet soda in my office and then to burp and not blow the germs away. So what do you think happened? Well, when we looked at the fear thermometer, his anxiety level went up to like 9.5 out of 10. And you could see it. You could see it on his face. His face was contorted. He was so incredibly anxious in that moment. It was mind-blowing. It was hard to watch. But how long does it take to get down to about a 5? Probably about 3 minutes. Somewhere between 3 and 8 minutes, and it's way down. It doesn't go down to a 1. It goes down to about a 5. And most of us can manage a 5. So that's the goal. Just bring it down. So we use the fear thermometer to work through and watch our anxiety coming down. Then the second tool is to give your child's fear a nickname. This helps you to externalize the fear. So the fear is something you have, not something you are. You are not your fear. It is something you have. It's not something you are. Encourage them to use that nickname. It could be something like fear gremlin or dread pest or worry bug, so that you can say, "Hey, is that worry bug I'm hearing?" And you don't have to focus on that fear or try to rationalize it because they know the answer. The third tool is the candy jar. I like this tool. Now, when I talk to parents about this, they never use it. So I don't know. I just think it's fun. So what you do is you get a jar and you fill up the jar with yellow marbles. And each time they confront a fear and work through it, they can replace that yellow marble with a blue marble or something like that, and watch the fears going away. By the way, you might say, well, how many fears can there be? Kids have a lot of fears. Fear of the dark. A little girl that I see currently is afraid of birds coming into her bedroom. And so she will make sure her windows are shut every night, has to check the windows several times over. Then she'll put a heavy blanket over the drapes, or I'm not sure if the blinds or whatever. And then her parents, and this is a safety behavior, built a kind of a tent over her bed so that as a last line of defense, if birds were to come in, they couldn't get to her in her bed. That's the safety behavior. It's to make her feel a little bit better, but it doesn't help her amygdala learn to overcome that fear. So now with enough exposure therapy, she, step by step, she stopped checking the windows. She has taken the blanket down, and now finally she's taken the tent away. And so each time, if her parents did this, they could replace a yellow marble with a blue marble. She would also do things like staying up late so she wouldn't have to go to bed. That would be another thing, going to bed at an earlier time. You break it down into smaller parts. And with ADHD, that's really, really, really important. And then rewards is the final tool. Now, a lot of people with ADHD say, or kids with ADHD, parents of kids with ADHD kind of really wonder, do you really need to reward everything? And you really do. And the rewards you give are not only your praise, but that's very important. Your praise is critically important because kids are not getting enough affirmations. They're not getting nearly enough positives, and they're getting lots and lots of negatives. And I find that when I'm dealing with even one of my own grandsons with ADHD, that I'm constantly using the word stop. Stop jumping on the furniture. Don't do that. cut that out, slow down. What's that like to hear that all the time? And kids develop this sense that their environment is punitive, and they become very defensive and they withdraw. So we want to give them rewards for doing the positive opposite. And we want to give them rewards for confronting their fear. So what you can do is you can say, if going to school is really hard, when you go to school, if you can get there, you have to break it up into smaller parts, like driving to school, getting out of the car and walking to the office in the front, going from the office to your classroom. And sometimes you have to say, we'll begin with me driving you to school, walking you to the front office, and then I'll walk halfway to your classroom. That's step one. Step two will be, I'll walk with you to the office. Step three might be, I'll walk with you from the car halfway to the office. Step four might be, I'll wait in the car and wait till you're in the building. And then ultimately, you'll go in the bus or something like that. Maybe there are 10 steps. We'll talk about that in a minute. And for each step that the child accomplishes, you give rewards. And you can use, we've talked about using a debit card where you put certain amounts of money in. You can give points on a point chart. But those rewards are very important because kids with ADHD, parts of their brain that subtend reward are underfed compared to neurotypical kids. So the rewards, the positives have to be much more positive. They have to be bigger, more immediate, more dramatic, more regular, and so on. So rewards are critically important. You can reward your child's willingness to confront their fear. If a child is doing exposure therapy, where they face those fears step by step, it's very hard. Exposure therapy is really, really difficult. Now we're going to go to ADHD-related sleep behaviors. And I'd mentioned that I've kind of developed a dialogue with some people at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital and their work on ADHD, which is, in my opinion, the best in the world, maybe. And they have been doing some research on a sleep program called Siesta. And I'm going to incorporate that into my parent meetings. Kids with ADHD have sleep problems. If you have a child with ADHD, you know all about sleep problems. And I think some of it comes from anxiety and from rumination, but it's a significant problem. They're time blind. So as we've seen in the previous lectures, they have difficulty with the passage of time. And so they simply don't know how to monitor time. And then their circadian rhythm gets out of whack. And once that happens, it's very hard to rectify it in the short term. So this is I can't go into too much of this now because you'll have to join one of my groups if you have a child with ADHD, but the Siesta program is very effective. And it does a lot of sleep hygiene, a lot of helping the child with rumination, and some skill training as well. And now my slide is being very silly again. So, okay, how do we teach distress tolerance skills? Now, remember I told you that story about Oliver Sacks? And so you learn by doing. So you learn by teaching the skill over and over and over again. You go through the same steps. When I was teaching my people with brain injury how to avoid, how to do certain things despite their brain injury, they didn't remember that I had taught them, but we were able to help to desensitize them to the smell of alcohol, so much so that they wouldn't just walk into a bar if they walked past it, which was very often the case. So when you have a brain injury, you shouldn't drink, by the way. TBI and alcohol don't mix well, and the brain is you're much more likely to have significant damage to your brain if you've had a TBI and you continue drinking. If you don't, by the way, this is neither here nor there, but it's just interesting. If you have a TBI, traumatic brain injury, and you don't drink, there's a lot of neurodegeneration that can occur. Your brain can actually get a lot better. If you drink even a little bit, you stop that from happening. So that's why we wanted to have a program in place for helping people. And how do you do that? You can't have them go to AA because they don't remember that they went. They don't remember the information. We have to teach them by doing. So we did a lot of skill training, a lot of role playing, lot of exposure therapy, and they learned by doing to overcome that craving for alcohol. Here's how you say it to your child. You can say something like this. And I like to do this in conjunction with a picture of the brain on the next slide. That is a wonderful picture. If your child loves coloring, you can tell them about all these different parts of their brain while you tell them this little thing. Everybody has some anxiety. Anxiety can be helpful. It's normal. Think about an athlete who must perform in front of a crowd. Having some anxiety is going to motivate them to perform at their best. Our amygdala is a part of the brain that is always trying to predict what is going to happen next, so it can keep us safe and help us to perform. If the amygdala decides that something is wrong because it's our smoke detector, then you're going to feel anxious and you're going to feel like you have to fight the threat or avoid it. Another part of your brain called the hippocampus talks back to your amygdala, and your hippocampus is like your brain's librarian. It goes to the front part of your brain and it says, what happened last time? And it tries to pull that memory and then present that to the amygdala. And it might say something like, dude, last time you were afraid of a tornado, nothing happened. You remember that? And so, your amygdala may eventually settle down. However, if your amygdala is so fired up, it'll shut down the front part of your brain and it won't be able to retrieve those hindsight memories, especially in the case of ADHD where hindsight is impaired anyway. And so then we want to teach your amygdala, not the front part of your brain. We want to teach it to be able to stay with the fear and learn from experience that nothing bad happens. Fight or flight is what your amygdala does to trigger automatic body and thinking changes if you're in a dangerous situation. Your adrenal glands release tons of adrenaline, your heart beats faster, you get ready to run or fight, your pupils dilate to let in more light and improve your vision. You may have pinprick vision, you may have tunnel vision, you might be able to see better, you might be able to hear better. It's an incredible process that gets you ready for fight or flight. And I've told the story that I saw on television about a little boy who was in the garage. There was closed circuit TV, and his dad was working under a car, and the car fell on his dad. And you can see from the video, it's on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube, and you can find 40 others just like it. And the child walked up to the car and lifted the car, like a 12-year-old. And the dad slid out from under the car. It's hard to believe unless you actually see this on the video. So what happened there? It's this amazing fight or flight that gives you about 0.5 seconds of incredible strength. And then, of course, they say, well, let's go try it again. Let's go to the garage. Let's try to lift the car. And you can't do it. So the fight or flight reaction is not only normal, but it's pretty amazing. So when I explain this to kids, I will give them one of two diagrams. The one is for older kids, and the other one is for little kids, and help them to see what happens. And then I'll ask questions like this. Do you ever feel any of these feelings? In what situations do you notice them? What sets them off? What do you think about these body feelings? When you feel scared or anxious, what do you notice in your body? What do you notice in your mind? If there was a lion chasing you, why would it be a good thing for your heart to beat faster? Actually, my wife and I go to the Kruger National Park in Africa, and if the lion's chasing you, there's pretty much nothing you can do. So you just sit down on a rock somewhere and accept your fate. Well, now you can yell at the lion. As the game rangers will always tell you, they're more afraid of you than you are of them. I'm not sure I believe that, though. I was telling my wife I think I told you guys about this a few weeks ago when I talked about the Pilanesberg elephants. There was recently a guy who got out of his car, walked towards a herd of elephants to get a better shot. And needless to say, got trampled to death. So if you stay in your car, you're perfectly safe, but just don't get out of your car. So we want the child to realize that their anxiety is normal. It's even healthy. And we want them not to see their anxiety as an enemy, that's something that has to be changed, but something that they need to befriend and work with. There's a wonderful book that I will talk about a little bit later by Lisa Feldman Barrett, who she talks about her daughter doing karate and having butterflies in her tummy, and the sensei saying to her, "Do you have butterflies in your tummy?" And the little girl said, "Yes, I do." And the sensei said, "Let your butterflies fly in formation." That's a beautiful concept. Use your anxiety, befriend your anxiety. It's not your enemy. Now, when we look at how we actually teach these skills, this is the only way that I believe you can actually do it. So the next slide on learning to relax. When I was doing my doctorate, I came up with this model, which I've used ever since that time. It's the IMRFH model. Give the child an instruction. That's the I. Model it, demonstrate it for them, rehearse it with them, preferably in a role play, give them feedback about their performance, and then give them homework and ask them to try it and follow up the next day. So for example, if you're teaching a child social skills and the skill you're teaching is complimenting, say, when you give somebody a compliment, look at what they're doing and say something nice about it. Okay, so that's the instruction. Model it. You could say, for example, I might say, "You're really good at drawing." So that's the modeling part. The rehearsal part is you say to the child, "What would you say?" Well, I would also say, "You're good at drawing." And I would say, "I like the color that you made that part of the drawing," or something like that. Feedback, you say, "You did a really good job about that." Feedback, you start with positive, and then you say, maybe be a little more excited about how good his drawing is, and then say, "Can you go and give somebody a compliment tomorrow and come back and tell me?" Now, how many times do you have to go through this whole process? Probably 20. It's by repetition. Remember, you're trying to overcome executive function difficulties that are delayed by 30 to 40%. So you need to do a lot of repetition, and role playing is great because you're learning by doing. That's what we did with the traumatic brain injury patients. We were learning by doing. And if you can do it in a role play, there's a good chance you can do it in real life. So learning to relax, you teach these skills, and I'm not going to go into them, you can read that, but you teach them by instruction, by modeling. When I do relaxation training with little kids, I always show them how to breathe. And then the next time I ask them to show me how they were using it, and they always do it wrong. So you have to do it over and over and over again before they do it correctly. So this is actually a really nice little handout for how to do that correctly. And then exposure, you work out ladders. So this is an example, facing your fear, and the fear is afraid of speaking in class, raising your hand or giving a speech or something like that. And so what you do is you start really low, and then you work on different steps. The final step would be talking in class alone. You can provide rewards for each step. There was a kid that I saw once who had ADHD. She was a cross-country runner, and on one of her training runs, got attacked by a dog and mauled. She was really badly hurt by the dog. And of course, she was afraid of dogs, but she also stopped running, and she was a really good runner. So in the exposure therapy, there were probably at least this many steps. And some of the earliest steps were to look at YouTube pictures of friendly dogs. The next step, dogs barking. The next step, dogs growling. And even the lowest steps caused her a great deal of anxiety. So we're helping her amygdala to get used to them one step at a time. And then sort of about 3/4 of the way up, her uncle was a police officer. He was a dog handler. And so he was a canine officer. And so he worked with her with his dog. And so that was a pretty high step for her. And then her final step was to go and run the very route that she ran where the dog attacked her. That was the very last step. And you can imagine how incredibly good she felt about having overcome that fear step by step. But you can't just say to the child, let's go for a run and run on that same course. That wouldn't be, that would be very hard for a child to do. Detective thinking skills. I like doing detective thinking skills. So I explain to kids that how we feel affects how we think affects how we feel. So our thoughts dictate our feelings in many situations. Our anxiety is not the result of situations. It is about what we're telling ourselves about that situation. And we have these automatic thoughts. We have hundreds of them. Some of them are neutral, but some of them are very negative. And kids with ADHD often have a kind of a threat bias because they've been told to stop and cut it out so much of the time that they interpret a lot of situations as threatening. And so we want them to work through this. And I like this worksheet, and you can use it in different ways, but these are the questions I like kids to think about on the detective thinking worksheet. What is happening in this situation? What are my worry thoughts? So let's take an example. What is happening? I have to give a talk to my class. So that's, tomorrow at 11 o'clock, I'm going to have to do a 5-minute presentation to the whole class. What are my worry thoughts? I'm going to make a mistake. Kids are going to laugh at me. They're going to think I'm terrible at this. They are going to notice how nervous I am. And so the more they talk about those worries, the better. And then you ask some important questions. What evidence is there for your worry thought? Is there evidence that kids are going to laugh at you? Has that happened before? Has everyone laughed at you? If one person laughs at you, does that mean they're all laughing at you? Is there evidence against it? Do you laugh at other kids when they're giving a talk? Do you notice people are just nice to you? And so if nothing else, they can say, well, some people may laugh, but not everybody. Well, that's a step in the right direction. Is my fear possible or likely? This is a very important question. Possible or likely? Whenever we fly to South Africa, my wife and I, when you're on that plane, you get kind of nervous. I do anyway. And I do enjoy flying, but I got to tell you, there's some fear associated with that. And I remember when we went on the Airbus A380, biggest airplane in the world, and we're at Chicago and at O'Hare, and it just seems like we've been taking off for like 3 minutes. And I keep thinking, we're going to run out of runway. And I keep thinking in my mind, I keep saying, put the brakes on now, put the brakes on. And then, it just takes off. It's an incredible thing. But I get very nervous taking off. And so is it possible that the airplane will crash? Yeah, it's possible. Is it likely? No. Right now, there are probably 100,000 airplanes in the sky. And I know that because during 9/11, when they grounded all the planes, at the moment they grounded them, there were 120,000 airplanes in the air. So think about that. It's probably at least that many, right? But how many accidents are you going to hear about today? I guarantee you, well, I don't guarantee it, but I'm pretty sure you won't hear of one. And this goes on day after day after day. When you're flying to South Africa, I always look to see how much fuel the plane has and what its range is. And then I think, wow, they've only got like 300 miles of fuel left? That doesn't sound very wise. I get nervous about that. But actually, you got, nautical miles are not the same as regular miles and blah, blah, blah. So is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? No. What else might happen? Well, might just have a nice flight. Might hit some turbulence, but probably not that bad. What would I tell my friend if he thought this way or she thought this way? Sometimes you tell your friend, you feel better. So tell your friend what you would like to hear. And then there are these other kinds of worksheets, these other statements they can go through that are very helpful. Uncertainty with ADHD is a big deal. And so this is just a nice little handout which you have about embracing uncertainty. Kids with ADHD, with autism spectrum, don't like change, but sometimes we should deliberately shake things up and try different things, trying different foods, trying a different kind of toothpaste, sleeping on the other side of the bed, those kinds of things. And then this is just a nice little handout for writing down some helpful thoughts, like I'm getting better and better. My anxiety is not a terrible thing. It's my friend. My anxiety helps me. Those kinds of thoughts. Now let's look at oppositional and defiant behaviors. And again, you know, this is an entire thing all by itself. And with my parent groups, it's 12 to 15 groups just talking about ADHD and oppositional defiant behavior, because there's no way I can cover that material now, so I'm not even going to try. But I'm going to tell you about some of the most important things. First of all, probably 50 to 60% of kids with ADHD also have oppositional defiant behavior. I call it oppositional defiant behavior, not oppositional defiant disorder, because I don't believe it is a disorder. I believe it's a continuum of behavior, and some kids have it a little bit and some have it a lot, but it's not a disorder. And there's a lot of stigma that goes along with calling it a disorder. There is a genetic component, but parenting and nurture can overcome that loading. That is, it can overcome that genetic loading. That's some of the most incredible research that I've read this year, is the research about overcoming genetic loading. And you see this a lot with kids who are in foster care, who are adopted, and where the biological parents had lots and lots of antisocial behavior or problems like that. They're adopted by lovely families who are warm and kind and nurturing and patient, and you see the child growing up to be a wonderful, not oppositional defiant child with time. There are some dimensions of oppositional defiant behavior, irritability and defiance. It's important to know what it is, because irritability goes along with internalizing problems like depression and anxiety, and defiance is more likely to produce externalizing symptoms like shoplifting, substance abuse, tantrums, yelling, fighting, aggression, things like that. It doesn't mean the one has a better outcome than the other, though. They have different kinds of outcomes. But often those kids who externalize actually end up doing better because we can see the behavior. It's not inside. Girls in particular internalize and have more irritability than defiance. And then there is something called callous unemotional traits, and these are behaviors that occur when the child seems to lack conscience, seems to lack a sense of guilt or wrongness. These are concerning behaviors when you see them. But again, the research is that using emotion coaching and positive parenting can overcome that genetic loading and that state pretty well. So 5 tools for changing oppositional defiant behaviors. Now remember, with ADHD, the child has a problem stopping, right? They have a problem with response inhibition. The brain's brakes aren't working as well, and their development of the brain's brakes are delayed 30 to 40% or more even. So I always begin with helping the child and the parents to focus on the positive opposite. If we focus on the positive opposite, we don't have to say stop. For example, if the behavior is hitting, the positive opposite might be keeping your hands to yourself. So instead of constantly saying stop hitting, we say, remember, keep your hands to yourself. And then when the child does that, we can go to the second step, which is using positive reinforcement to systematically strengthen those positive opposites. Lots of praise, lots of rewards, point charts, immediate positive praise that is effusive and clear. We say what we are praising. We don't just say, you're a good kid. That doesn't help. You're a good kid because you kept your hands to yourself. I'm really proud of you. And it's clean where you don't say, you don't caboose. You don't say, why don't you do that all the time? So that's what I mean by immediate, effusive, clear, and clean praise. Now, how many times do you have to do that? Probably about 200. But if you do, you're really creating a new behavioral habit. The child will keep his hands to himself without even realizing that he is. You've now trained it as a habit, a new positive habit that replaces the old negative behavior. In my Tuesday night groups, there are ways that we do this through point charts, and you really want to do, it would be like saying, if your child, have you ever heard parents saying, I know my child knows how to do this because I've seen him do it? That's really terrible. That's not a good example, because we all know how to do things that we don't do. So the problem with ADHD, remember, is not that the child doesn't know what to do, it's that they don't do what they know. It's an intention deficit. It's problems with doing what you know. So just like if your child learns how to play the violin, you don't expect that he can go and play in the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, at least not this week. It takes time, lots and lots and lots of practice. And then we do reinforced practice, which means give as many opportunities as possible to perform the desired behavior and be rewarded. And one way to do that is through shaping, where you break it up into small parts, like getting to bed without fuss could be broken down into 10 steps. You reward each step, you reinforce as the child goes, and then you can even use extinction, which is the last step, which is if one part of that isn't done, you ignore it. You just focus on what the child is doing, and you come back to the step that he's not doing the next day, and you keep working on it. And maybe it takes 2 weeks, but he will be going to bed on time. And many of the families that I've seen who've had problems with that have found that about 2 weeks is what it takes. 2 weeks of doing the positive opposite, breaking it up into small parts, and sometimes even having, today I saw a mom who had a chart on her wall with the steps for going to bed. Take a shower, brush your teeth, put your clothes out for tomorrow. And each time the child did one of those steps, she would reward that, she would praise it. If he didn't do the step, she would ignore it. She wouldn't make a big deal out of it. So there's no stopping needed. It's just tomorrow you got 4 points today. Let's see if we can get to 6 tomorrow. And no comparing the child with another child, because some children don't have ADHD and they do these things without being asked. But we need to be very careful about that. Very mild punishment can be helpful, the next tool, but should be phased out in favor of increasing positive opposites. We want to teach new behavioral habits, not stop negative behaviors. We want to switch our perspective from what do I want my child to stop doing to what do I want my child to do. Timeouts are often used by parents as a punishment. I propose using it not as a punishment, but as a take 5. How many of us do that? How many of us just take a break sometimes? Yep. And so we want to encourage that. We want to say it's a normal, healthy thing to do. And if you do that, I'm going to reward you. I'm going to give you 2 points if you take a timeout. And you can suggest it as well. The trouble with timeout is that, often parents will say, okay, you've got 1 hour of timeout. And then if that doesn't work, because it won't work, it gets escalated until the child's grounded for 3 months or something. And we're never going to be able to keep that up anyway. One time I had a kid whose parents, out of a sense of desperation, child with ADHD, took away her most favored activity, which was theater. She loved theater. And it was so sad because that was something that made her happy and brought her in contact with friends and gave her some positives and some, she had good self-efficacy in that area. And so she couldn't do theater that semester. And then the next year, when she had worked through some things, the parents said, you can do theater again. And she said, no, I've moved on. I'm not going to do that anymore. That's sad, don't you think? I mean, don't ever take away something that builds your child's self-confidence and self-efficacy. If it's something like, a video game and you don't let them play the video game, which is probably a good thing, That's one thing, for a day or something, but don't take away things that build their self-esteem. Using overcorrection means if your child is naughty, have them put the situation right, but maybe go a step further. If they threw out all the toys on the carpet, maybe also have them clear the dining room table or something like that. Use positive practice, which means do role plays. Role plays are really, really powerful. I do role plays in my office. In the office next door, there's a mirror, there's a full-length mirror, and we sometimes go there and practice in front of the mirror what you look like when you're angry and how you look when you're relaxed and things like that. And by the way, there was there's one kid who I'd seen, and we used the mirror a lot, and I do group therapy with teenagers, and the other day he took a member of the group and he said, "Come with me," and walked to the mirror and said, "Now let's do this in front of the mirror." And I just smiled and thought, I wonder where you learned that from. But it was very sweet to watch. All right, and then the last thing I want to talk about is emotion coaching for ADHD and oppositional behavior. So what is emotion coaching? So this is the best book I read this year is a book called How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain by Lisa Feldman Barrett. Beautiful book. It reads like a novel. So if you ever want to read a really great book, it's very complicated. You'll have to read it like 3 times. But here's what it's at its core, this is what the theory of constructed emotion says, which is now the dominant theory of emotion and of learning. Because, by the way, the idea that we have a vault in our brain of memories is actually false. We don't have. Our brain is not like a hard drive. In fact, every time we remember something, we recreate that memory. And we create a new memory that is laid down so that when you remember something, you're actually remembering the last time you remembered it. And the only person who has true amnesia, the only person who has perfect memory is the person who has full amnesia, because they never re-remember it. So it never changes. But every time you remember something, it changes. For example, you could say, a really great experiment, professor is just starting his class, and all of a sudden, a guy with short black hair runs in, grabs the professor's briefcase and runs out. Now, this is all being staged, of course, but no one knows that. And the professor, steps back like this and goes, "Oh my gosh." And the guy runs out. And the professor goes, and, the students are all like, "What just happened there?" And then the professor says, "You just don't expect that you'll be coming into class and a blonde, curly-haired kid comes and steals your briefcase." And just goes on. Kid didn't have blonde hair, didn't have curly hair, he had straight black hair. No one says anything. And then the police come, all staged, of course, and they say, "Can some of you who saw what happened please describe, okay, what color hair did the guy have?" "Blonde hair." "Was it straight or curly?" "Curly." And they really believe it. They really believe it. So are they remembering what happened, or are they remembering something that was implanted in their memory? It's a very simple example of something that actually happens. Memories are not stored in your brain like that. And we remember the last time we remembered. If you ever seen the movie Spotless Sunshine of the Eternal Soul? Anybody seen that movie? It's really a great movie. You should watch that. It's about a man who's trying to get memories of his girlfriend erased from his mind. And it's really a good film. You ought to watch that film. But the problem with the whole movie is that memories are not like a vault in your brain. That's not how they exist in your brain. So in the same way, emotions are not reactions to the world. They're actually predictions your brain makes. Now, this is really, really important because these predictions can be wrong. You could be predicting that these sensations in your body mean that you're going to need a lot of adrenaline. You may feel rage, which means a lot of adrenaline, a lot of oxygen, a lot of fight or flight. But if the interpretation is that I'm annoyed, you don't need as much adrenaline. So the prediction your brain makes is really important. Now, for a lot of kids with ADHD, it's all or nothing. So they either feel completely at peace or enraged. We need to teach them the middle levels. With your brain makes these interpretations and these predictions so quickly. And one of the things that's totally amazing is that vision, which is controlled by your visual cortex, only 10% of its input is coming from your retina. Think about that. 90% of what you see isn't coming through your eyes. It's coming from the rest of your brain interpreting what your retina is seeing. And so that's why people can see things that they don't see. And in reality, it's an amazing thing. So we need to make accurate predictions, which means we need to do the next thing, which is teach emotion granularity, which means lots of different feeling words. So again, using the fear thermometer or the anger thermometer, you can say, you know, a 1 on that thermometer is feeling annoyed. Feeling a 10 is rage, complete rage. And a lot of times when I say to a child, how angry were you on a scale from 1 to 10? They'll say, I was 10. If I say to their parents, how angry was your child? They'll say 10. But really, was it 10? Was there ever a time when you were more angry? Well, then it's not 10. And so the more we can help them to use the right term, annoyance, irritation, or maybe excitement rather than rage. So emotion coaching is all about that. I'm going to just skip over a few of these things, but I would like you to read these. The thing about emotion coaching is that we're trying to raise the emotional intelligence of the child. And it turns out that emotional intelligence is more important than verbal intelligence in terms of measuring outcomes. Kids who have high emotional intelligence do better in the world, even than other kinds of intelligence. So here are some nice, simple things you can do. And a lot of this has come from this beautiful book by Joanna Faber and Julie King, which is How to Talk So Little Kids Will Listen. There are other versions of that for older kids. It's really beautiful book. So recognize that all feelings can be accepted, but all choices are not acceptable. So that means whatever your child says, whatever he's feeling, he feels. Help him to feel it. Help him to express it. And you acknowledge that. So you start by acknowledging feelings. Something like, it can be so frustrating when there isn't enough time to finish building the puzzle. You make a reflection. And then you don't ask questions so much as you give reflections. Don't ask children why they feel that way, because they don't know. And neither do we. Don't use the word but. I understand you feeling like that, but don't do that. Instead, what you can do is you can say, I can see that you really are frustrated. Pause, 3 magic words. The problem is. And you describe the problem. It works so much better than using the word but. They recommend in this approach giving in fantasy what you cannot give in reality. John Gottman actually talks about being on an airplane with his child who was beginning to scream and demanding a stuffed toy that was in the hold. And she said, I want it now. And, you know, other passengers were kind of turning around, and John Gottman said, gosh, I really wish we had all kinds of stuffed animals, not only giraffe, but also Freddie the bear. And, you know, and by giving her in fantasy what he couldn't give her in reality, she settled down. And she kind of looked at him and said, yeah, that's right. So it's a beautiful little technique. Try problem solving, acknowledge the child's feelings, describe the problem, brainstorm ideas. Kids are good at brainstorming. They'll come up with some really wacky ideas, but just write them down. And then you both decide which are the best solutions. Tool 3 is you still have to set limits. And you set limits without insult. You don't have to, you describe what you see. You can describe how you feel. You can describe the choices the child has. Give a child a choice of 2 equally good options. You can either do your homework first and play your video game after, or you can play your video game first and do the homework after. So the child's going to choose the video game first, by the way. Put the child in charge, where you say, you set a timer, and when the timer goes off, then it's time for 30 minutes, and then it's time for your homework. And you can take action without insult, where you simply say, okay, I'm putting the game away for now. I cannot let time go away from us anymore. So let's get to work. And then model and teaching, making amends. And I actually finished on time. So, all right, questions. If anybody would like to be in one of those groups, I think they're wonderful groups. I'm not trying to recruit patients because I'm incredibly busy, but honestly, they're fun to watch, and it's nice because I can relax a little bit, and the parents help each other through the strategies, and that's awesome. And I still get paid.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have to have our son as a patient in order for us to be present for those groups?
No. No. I would need to see that child one time. Some of the kids I see actually have a therapist, and if they're happy with their therapist, then I'm very happy for them to carry on seeing that therapist. There's only one thing that is required, though, and that is that the child has to have an Aurora physician. So that's sometimes a problem, for because they don't have an Aurora doctor. The reason for that is that, each system, there are a couple of reasons for that. One, we have so many people trying to get help. But the other reason is that when I can see what the other issues are, so I can see in the chart, if a child has epilepsy or something, I kind of want to know that because I want to, there are some techniques that can make that worse, or something like that. Or if the child's been traumatized, I need to kind of know that. So that's the other reason. But as long as I have an Aurora physician, I can see the parents in the group and not see the child. Most of the kids, most of the parents I see in groups I do see the children as well. So it can go either way. Any other questions? Do we have any from the virtual?
We do have a few questions, unless there's anything from the audience.
And if you have any more, you're welcome to ask them. You don't have to. This isn't your last chance.
One of the questions that we had, Dr. Langley, what's the difference between not giving in to ADHD and anxiety at school, with the example of making them speak in front of the class, or giving into their anxiety OCD about making sure the birds aren't going into the window, when we know the birds won't actually fly into the window and attack?
So I'm not sure if I'm fully answering. I'll see if this helps. We know that it's not an issue of rational thinking. The child who's afraid of the birds knows there are not going to be birds coming into her room. The child who needs to give a talk in class probably knows that nothing terrible is going to happen. Other people have done it. It's just pushing through that fear. And what we need to do is make sure we do it in small steps. If you simply say, no, I expect you to go and give that 1 hour speech in front of your whole class, and there'll be 3 other classes watching as well, that's too big a step. So little steps, maybe the child gives a speech to the teacher and 2 of his friends first. And then maybe we bring a few more people in, and then a few more. So it can be 4 or 5 steps. You role play it first. You have the child role play it. If the child is prepared, you have him read this or give the speech in front of just you. You help them to visually kind of imagine themselves in the situation, and you talk about what they will do if they do get stressed out. So I talk about, in public speaking, I talk a lot about finding something in the classroom that becomes your focus point, and then every now and then look at that and say, I'm doing fine, talking to themselves through that, giving themselves instructions, rehearsing what those instructions would be. So it's not just you expect them to do it, it's step by step. Does that help?
The next question was, how do we go about explaining, and I just want to make sure I have the term, the callous unemotional traits to teachers or adults when my child has already been labeled as a child who lacks empathy?
Empathy is, we are born with that ability. And so sometimes experiences, especially trauma, can undermine that, and anxiety can undermine that. But even little kids, you can see empathy from about 3 months, and that's been well documented in a lot of research. I emphasize that these are behaviors, and there's something called alexithymia, which is inability to identify or express one's own emotions. Sometimes the child has alexithymia. The good thing about alexithymia is that it can respond well to teaching the child about their feelings and the nuances of those feelings. And there's also, in the case of autism spectrum disorder, often kids have the affective component of empathy. They feel the empathy, but they don't have the right context for it. So it seems like they don't have it. And so, they might feel a sense of empathy for a person, but they might change the subject because it reminds them of something else that they want to talk about. So the context, the factual aspect of the empathy is often not there. Or the other way around, sometimes they can understand in theory what it means to lose your dog, but they don't have the affect. It can kind of go both ways. But those are things that can be learned. And so that's how I would answer that.
Okay.
So can kids have like selective lack of empathy? Like almost like an abstinence? So like our son is very empathetic to most people, but when he gets in a situation where he's very frustrated I think it seems more directed towards me, and maybe it's just a mom thing. He can appear very unempathetic.
It may be that his empathy is just, there are other emotions that are competing for that same brain space, and he's just not able to access it at that moment. Don't take it personally, and assume that it's there, and it's just not taking up his anger, and his frustration is putting his amygdala in overdrive.
And how do you kind of like work through that? Or is it something that just, because I mean, I can try and tell myself not to take it personally, but over time, like, will it get potentially better? Or is it something that you say, hey, have your space and talk about it later? Or
you definitely wait it out. So, with anger, with frustration, as we talked about a few weeks ago, with tantrums, there is a sort of an anger component, and there's a distress component. So the anger component, the kid will yell and fight and kind of get mad, kick things, push things over. And then there's the distress phase where they'll whine and cry, roll on the ground, tell them, they'll say things like, you don't love me, you never loved me, you hate me, those kinds of things. That's the distress phase. When you see that phase, you can begin to do emotion coaching. And emotion coaching is you start with acknowledging the child's feelings. You're feeling really frustrated. It's really hard when you want something so badly and you can't get it. And you ask him, what are you feeling? Does that make you sad? Does it make you feel hurt? So anger is like the outside of the onion. That's the hard, crusty feeling. But typically on the inside, there's disappointment or hurt or sadness or loneliness or feeling left out or feeling overlooked. You try and get at those feelings. It takes time and patience.
but if they say they don't want to talk about it, back off.
You come back to it
Okay.
at another time. So he sounds like she sounds like a stubborn kid. Stubborn is the best quality, because that's
Telling yourselves that.
that's
I keep telling you.
yeah, it's stubborn is great. It's feistiness. And kids who are stubborn, another word for that is determined. It's insistent, and their kids are going to be able to negotiate for a pay raise better than I ever did. I have never ever negotiated for a pay raise. I just can't do it. Isn't that terrible to admit that? So, but that child won't have problems with that. Any other
Yep, I have a few more. I try to have a very calm, open talks with my 8-year-old son. He's been having a lot of behavior problems at his new school. I want to trust him. What he tells me is completely opposite of what teachers write on behavior sheets and stated that the other kids have started it. You said to reward the truth, but I'm not sure what is the truth. Any help?
These are hard questions.
That's the only way they come.
Right. Well, first of all, stay with the child and advocate for the child, because sometimes the child is telling the truth. Their interpretation, if you focus on feelings are pretty honest, so you can if you acknowledge feelings and you stay listening, sometimes the child will come around to the point where they tell you what's really happening. There's a kid that I saw this week, and I'll be honest, at the beginning of the session, I just thought, I have no idea what I'm going to do here. This child has been severely traumatized, wouldn't let his caregiver leave the office, was crying, was kicking. It just seemed like a very difficult, situation. Wouldn't make eye contact. And I eventually sat on the carpet and I started building something. And then I told the story about my childhood. And within about 3 minutes, he started looking at me and he started asking questions, and it just totally normalized everything. It was really good. I felt really good about that session, because it was a remarkable change. And I think part of it is just being patient and staying there. Talk to the teachers. I really like to emphasize with teachers, if you have one of those charts, make sure you're writing down positive opposites and not fighting in class. If we focus on fighting in class, we're just going to reinforce it. So the positive opposite of that is cooperating, or playing nicely with other kids, or being respectful. And I would argue that with a little bit of encouragement, the teacher can find ways to see those behaviors. If you say to a child who's very naughty and you give him a job to do, and then you can get to, I know it's hard. I mean, you got like 20 kids and they all have ADHD, or it seems that way. It's hard, but you can find ways to reinforce those positive opposites. And then, so I would ask the teacher, are you seeing any of these behaviors? Can you focus on those? And then when the child comes home, you can pre-teach for the next day. You can say, I know that sometimes it's hard to deal with all the noise going on. Let's try this. And then ask the teacher to give you some feedback on that, build that collaboration with the school and that dialogue. The take-home note that I gave in the first presentation only has positives. And there's no like smiley face, frowny face, straight face, because kids they'll just begin to compare themselves with other kids, and just smiley faces. If the teacher does not circle the smiley face, you need to work on that area. So you can do, coaching with that. But I would argue that it's maybe not a matter of the child lying. It might be a problem of shame, and in the short term, wanting to avoid an immediate consequence like being yelled at or something like that. So we need to take that off the table, I think, and not do that much yelling. And not that this person yells. I'm saying we need to somehow find a way to keep referring back to the positive opposite and encouraging the child to do that, and even maybe role playing it.
So acknowledging more of what they're saying and allowing some of that conversation about me.
And maybe helping the teacher to identify ways to spot those behaviors and reinforce them. And, I talk about putting 10 pennies in your left-hand pocket, and every time you see that behavior, move one over to the right, and then praise the child, and maybe do 20. If you have two parents and you each reinforcing a positive opposite 20 times a day, and you do that for a week, that's 140 trials. That behavior is going to increase just by repetition.
Okay, thank you.
And then if the child does tell the truth, if you can say, truth telling is important. If you tell the truth, you're not going to get punished. I'm going to be really proud of you. And so you emphasize, you keep saying that over and over again. If you tell the truth, it's nothing to be ashamed of. And you can even give examples from your own childhood of times when you weren't truthful or something like that, which in my case was never. I was always truthful.
Always. Another question was, most of the behavior is stopping a behavior. What if you need a child to start a behavior?
That's exactly the point. That's what we want. So, but I think what the person is probably talking about is initiating a behavior. Break it up into smaller parts, and then, so something like starting work on homework, the steps could be, what I tell kids is get all your homework on the table, get it all ready, and then take a little break. So the first step is just get it on the table, get it organized, take a break, come back, set the timer for 15 minutes, and then you just do 15 minutes, and you take another 5-minute break. And so you break it up into smaller parts.
Okay. And then the last one I have is, can you elaborate and give an example of the difference between reassurance and praise?
Reassurance and praise?
Yes.
Yeah. So reassurance would be where the child is anxious about something and you reassure them that everything's okay. It's fine. There are no birds coming into your room. It's dark outside. The birds have all gone to sleep. That's reassurance. The child will say, okay, thank you. They'll feel better. But it just teaches their amygdala that there really is something to fear. And so the fear doesn't go away. My mother-in-law was afraid of birds. It always makes me smile when I think of my mother-in-law. I had a pet duck, and I would take the duck over to when my wife and I were dating, and my duck would sometimes come in the house, and she'd be freaked out. It was the greatest fun. Anyway, but that's reassurance. Praise would be commenting on something good the child has done, and we have to do a lot of praise. It always, the interesting thing is that maybe it's my imagination, but when I see teenagers who respond to affirmation from me, I typically find that they have parents who are affirming. And so they learn to accept affirmation. And so we need to really, really affirm kids. So affirmation is different from praise, by the way. Praise is, you did a really good job getting to bed on time last night. I'm proud of you. That's specific. That's praising a specific behavior. Affirmation is referring to the child's character, their traits, like stubborn. I always like to tell kids when they're stubborn, I like to say, I love your stubbornness. It's a really great thing. It means you're determined, and you didn't give up on that project. You kept pushing, and that is awesome. You're a very stubborn kid. I once told an adult that I was seeing that she was stubborn, and she stopped seeing me. So I try to explain that that's actually a compliment, but stubborn is a really wonderful trait. It's a wonderful behavior. You just have to suck it up, and it's hard. It's hard, but kids who are stubborn do well in the world. They do better, but it has to be shaped. I mean, obviously, it has to be respectful.
If the child is in the middle of a panic or meltdown and is exhibiting avoidance coping mechanisms, trying to avoid going to school, for example, because they are afraid, how do you handle that?
So get proactive. That's the first step. If it's happening, there's probably nothing you can do at that point. They're in full fight or flight. But talk about it later on that day and say, going to school is really important. And use some, what is referred to as motivational. In my group with oppositional defiant behavior, the last part we do is motivational coaching, where we try to help the child to develop the intrinsic desire to want to do those behaviors. So you talk about the importance of school, you break it up into small parts, and again, it could be something like, if you're able to get into the building, that's 2 points. If you're there and you don't leave the classroom, that's 2 points. You break it up into smaller parts and you reinforce each part. But you have to come back to it. You have to come back to it. That if you give in, then the behavior is going to get worse. And is it anxiety? Absolutely. The kid's not manipulating. Kids are not necessarily, it's very rare that a child will manipulate. They are truly anxious. And if we give in to their anxiety, we strengthen their anxiety. So we have to find ways to break it up into smaller parts, lots of rewards. Kids love being rewarded. Good, cold, hard cash. Sometimes I have teenagers who come and see me and I think, this kid really doesn't want to come, but they keep coming. And I think, is the parent paying them to come to therapy? And I don't really care. I mean, they're coming, and but often it's just that they're not going to admit that they like it. So, any more questions, or we're done? Thank you very much. Thanks for coming to all three, and it's been great seeing you guys. Take care.
Thank you so much, everyone. To those online, appreciate the questions. Remember to complete the evaluation. And Dr. Langley, thank you so much.
Hey, this is interesting, Chris. Look at this. So this must have just done this automatically. It said it's trying to access the, look here. I don't know, maybe it's just Norton warning me that.
It is interesting.
I've never seen that before. I was wondering if it was trying to